Deep in the frozen silence of the Arctic Circle, a man who had not spoken a single word in weeks looked down at the body of a police officer and let out a single, ghastly laugh. For 48 days, this lone fugitive would outrun dog teams, scale vertical cliffs, and survive 50 below temperatures, sparking the most expensive and technologically advanced manhunt in Canadian history. The story begins on July 9, 1931, when a stranger paddled a small canoe into the settlement of Fort McPherson in the Northwest Territories. He was a muscular man in his late 30s with a quiet, intense gaze and a thick, dark beard, and he introduced himself to the locals simply as Albert Johnson. Johnson was remarkably taciturn, avoiding eye contact and offering no information about where he had come from or why he was there. He had roughly $2,000 in cash on him, an absolute fortune during the Great Depression, which he used to buy supplies before heading further into the wilderness. He eventually settled near the Rat River, where he built a small, incredibly sturdy log cabin. It was not a typical trapper's shack. It was a fortress, constructed with thick logs and designed with narrow slits for windows that offered a wide field of fire while keeping the occupants shielded. By December, local Gwich'in trappers, including a man named William Nurisu, began to complain to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They reported that someone was tampering with their traplines, tripping the iron jaws of the traps and hanging them from trees to prevent them from catching anything. On December 26, 1931, Constable Alfred Buns King and Special Constable Joe Bernard traveled to the Rat River to question Johnson about the complaints. When they arrived at the cabin, they saw smoke rising from the chimney, but when they knocked, the man inside refused to acknowledge them. The officers shouted through the walls, explaining they only wanted to talk, but the silence from within was absolute. After several hours of standing in the bitter cold, the officers were forced to retreat to Aklavik to obtain a search warrant, frustrated by the strangers' bizarre lack of cooperation. On New Year's Eve, Constable King returned with 3 other men and a legal warrant in hand. As King approached the door and announced his presence, a sudden, deafening blast echoed through the valley. Albert Johnson had fired a shot through the wooden door without saying a word. The bullet struck Constable King in the chest, seriously wounding him. The other officers managed to drag King to safety under a heavy barrage of gunfire from the cabin, and they began a desperate 20-hour race across 80 miles of frozen tundra to get him to a doctor. Miraculously, King survived his injuries, but the incident turned a minor dispute into a full-scale criminal investigation. The police returned on January 9th with a force of 9 men, 42 dogs, and 20 pounds of dynamite, determined to bring the shooter to justice. For 15 hours, the police laid siege to the cabin in temperatures that had plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. They eventually threw the dynamite onto the roof, the explosion blowing the structure apart and sending logs flying into the dark night air. The officers rushed the ruins, expecting to find Johnson dead or incapacitated, but as they approached, a series of rapid shots rang out from the ground. Johnson had dug a deep hole beneath the floorboards, creating a reinforced bunker that the explosion had failed to reach. Low on food and with their dogs freezing in the extreme cold, the posse was forced to retreat once again. When they returned on January 14th with more reinforcements, they found the cabin completely empty. Albert Johnson had vanished into the heart of a blizzard. The Great Arctic Manhunt had begun, covering some of the most treacherous terrain on the planet. Johnson was traveling on foot, carrying a heavy pack and his rifles, yet he was moving faster through the deep snow than the police dog teams were. Johnson was a master of evasion, utilizing every trick in the book to lose his pursuers. He walked on bare ice where no footprints could be left, traveled in wide circles to confuse trackers, and reportedly even put his snowshoes on backward to make it look like he was heading in the opposite direction. The police were joined by River Sittichinli, a Gwich'in special constable and legendary tracker. Sittichinli was amazed by Johnson's physical prowess, noting that the fugitive was breaking his own trail through the snow at a pace that should have been impossible for a man without a dog team. On January 30th, a patrol led by Constable Edgar Millen finally caught up to Johnson in a thicket of trees during a blinding snowstorm. A fierce shootout erupted as the wind howled around them, the visibility dropping to almost nothing in the whiteout conditions. In the chaos of the blizzard, a single shot rang out and struck Constable Millen directly in the heart, killing him instantly. The other officers reported hearing a terrifying, hollow laugh coming from the trees where Johnson was hiding before the fugitive slipped away into the white void. The death of a popular officer like Millen shocked the nation and turned the pursuit into a matter of national pride. Desperate to end the hunt, the RCMP took the unprecedented step of hiring a civilian bush pilot to assist in the search from the air. The pilot was Wilfred Wap May, a legendary World War I flying ace. This marked the first time in history that a bush pilot and a radio were used to track a fugitive, a move that would change the nature of law enforcement in the North forever. While the police on the ground struggled through the deep snow, May soared above the Richardson Mountains, scouting for any sign of smoke or tracks. He ferried supplies and extra ammunition to the ground teams, keeping the hunt alive in the brutal conditions. Johnson's most incredible feat of survival occurred when he reached the base of the Richardson Mountains. The police believed they had him cornered against a vertical 2,100-foot cliff that no man could possibly climb, especially during a winter storm. But when the sun rose the next day, the trackers found snowshoe prints leading straight up the mountain and over the top. Johnson had scaled the sheer face in the middle of the night, in temperatures reaching 50 degrees below zero, without any climbing gear. Even the veteran trackers were stunned by this achievement. Johnson had crossed into the Yukon, a feat that should have been a suicide mission for any human being, yet he continued to move with a calculated, relentless energy that seemed almost supernatural. On February 14th, Wap May was flying over the Bell River when he spotted something unusual. He noticed a set of tracks that seemed to merge with the footprints of a caribou herd, a clever tactic Johnson was using to hide his trail from the air. May radioed the position to the ground teams, who were now closing in from several directions. The fugitive was finally being funneled toward the Eagle River, where the flat, open ice would offer him no place to hide from the aerial observer. On February 17, 1932, the final confrontation began on the frozen surface of the Eagle River. The police teams rounded a bend in the river and saw Johnson in the distance, his dark silhouette standing out clearly against the white ice. Realizing he was finally cornered, Johnson didn't try to run. He dropped into the snow and began firing his Savage rifle with deadly accuracy. A bullet struck Staff Sergeant H.F. Hersey, seriously wounding him as the police dived for cover along the riverbanks. A fierce firefight broke out, with bullets whistling across the ice from both sides. Wap May circled overhead in his plane, watching the drama unfold from above like a spectator in a deadly arena, unable to assist the men on the ground. The shootout lasted for several minutes until a final volley of shots from the RCMP hit their mark. Johnson was struck 9 times, the fatal bullet entering his pelvis and severing a major artery. The man who had outrun the law for weeks finally collapsed onto the ice. As the officers cautiously approached the body, they expected to finally hear the man speak, to hear a confession or a curse. But Albert Johnson died as he had lived throughout the entire ordeal, in absolute, defiant silence. When the police searched his body, they found an assortment of items that only deepened the mystery. He carried $2,410 in Canadian and American currency, a pocket compass, a small cache of fish hooks, and a set of gold dental work. The presence of such a large amount of cash and expensive dental work suggested that Johnson was not a common wilderness drifter. These were the possessions of someone from a much higher socioeconomic background than a typical northern trapper. They also found a sawed-off 16-gauge shotgun and 2 rifles. Despite the media's later use of the name Mad Trapper, the officers who pursued him noted that his actions were never those of a madman. He was highly calculated, disciplined, and incredibly skilled. The nickname Mad Trapper was a creation of the newspapers, who were hungry for a sensational story during the dark days of the Depression. To the public, he was a folk hero or a monster. To the police, he was simply a ghost they had finally caught. The biggest question remained: who was he? No one in the North recognized him, and his fingerprints did not match any records in Canada or the United States. He had no identification, no letters, and no photographs of family or friends. For decades, historians and amateur sleuths tried to solve the puzzle. One popular theory suggested he was an American fugitive named Arthur Nelson, but despite some similarities, the evidence was never conclusive enough to close the case. In 2007, a scientific team exhumed Johnson's body to conduct modern forensic tests. The results were startling. They discovered that Johnson suffered from scoliosis, a significant curvature of the spine that would have made his physical feats even more painful and improbable. His DNA was also analyzed, revealing that he was of Swedish ancestry. In 2021, a specialized forensic firm narrowed his lineage down to the descendants of Gustaf Magnusson and Britta Svensdotter, though his specific legal name remains a mystery. There is also a lingering doubt about the crime that started it all. Some historians believe that Johnson may never have tampered with the traplines at all, and that the initial complaint was a fabrication by local trappers who simply wanted the strange, wealthy outsider gone. If this is true, the entire bloody ordeal, the 3 wounded men, the death of Constable Millen, and the death of Johnson himself, was the result of a tragic misunderstanding and the extreme paranoia of a man who just wanted to be left alone. Albert Johnson remains a legend of the North, a symbol of the incredible endurance of the human body and the impenetrable mysteries of the human soul. He was a man who climbed mountains and outran machines, all while keeping his secrets locked behind a wall of silence. He was buried in a small cemetery in Aklavik, far from wherever he was born. To this day, his headstone bears the only name the world ever knew for him: Albert Johnson, the Mad Trapper of Rat River. The story of the Mad Trapper is a reminder that some people are determined to live and die on their own terms, no matter the cost. His true identity may be lost to time, but his legend is etched forever into the ice of the Canadian North. The silent fugitive who defied an empire and left the world wondering who he really was. If you found this story interesting, please subscribe for more true stories from history.